The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Walter's perfectly maintained front lawn as he slowly rocked in his favorite chair on the porch. At 93 years old, his body might have aged, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he served in World War II. His wrinkled hands, marked with age spots, gently held an old silver pocket watch, a gift from his late wife, Margaret. Living alone in the peaceful suburb of Pine Grove for the past 40 years, Frank had become something of a local legend. The neighborhood children called him Grandpa Frank, even though he wasn't their real grandfather. Every afternoon, weather permitting, he would sit on his porch and share fascinating stories about his time in the war with anyone willing to listen. Frank's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He woke up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit he couldn't shake from his military days. After a simple breakfast of toast and black coffee, he would put on his navy blue cardigan, no matter the weather, and walk 3 blocks to Sally's diner. A small bell above the door would announce his arrival, and before he could reach his usual corner booth, Sally herself would have his order ready: 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon, and a fresh cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Walters," Sally would say with her warm smile. She had been serving him breakfast for over 20 years, and like everyone else in town, she had a soft spot for the kind-hearted veteran. Frank would respond with a polite nod and a gentle smile, his blue eyes twinkling with the same charm that had won Margaret's heart 65 years ago. After breakfast, Frank spent most mornings tending to his garden. It wasn't just any garden. It was a carefully planned masterpiece of red roses, yellow daffodils, and purple irises, arranged in patterns that reminded him of military medals. Margaret had started this garden, and after she passed away 5 years ago, Frank had made it his mission to keep it blooming just as beautifully as she had. The local elementary school often brought students to visit Frank's garden. He would teach them about different flowers and sometimes slip in lessons about respect, bravery, and standing up for what's right. The children would listen with wide eyes as he pointed out each flower, explaining how some plants, like people, needed protection and care to grow strong. In his living room, Frank kept a wall of memories. Photographs from his time in the Pacific Theater hung alongside his military decorations: a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and other medals that told stories of courage and sacrifice. But his most prized possession was a faded photograph of him and Margaret on their wedding day, taken just after he returned from the war. She wore a simple white dress, and he stood proud in his military uniform, both of them young and full of dreams for their future together. The neighbors often checked on Frank, bringing him home-cooked meals or offering to help with house repairs. But Frank politely declined most offers of assistance. "I may be old," he would say with a chuckle, "but I can still take care of myself." And he could. His house was always immaculate, his clothes perfectly pressed, and his yard the best maintained on the block. Every evening, Frank would sit in his favorite armchair by the window, the one Margaret had roof-holstered twice, and write in his journal. He documented his daily experiences, memories of the war, and thoughts about the changing world around him. Sometimes he would write letters to Margaret, telling her about his day and how much he missed her, though these letters would never be sent. As the sun set each day, Frank would walk through his garden one last time, checking on his beloved flowers. The peaceful neighborhood would grow quiet, and the only sounds would be the chirping of crickets and the distant whistle of the 7:30 p.m. train. Frank would look up at the stars, say a quiet goodnight to Margaret, and head inside, grateful for another day in his quiet, pleasant life. Little did Frank know that his peaceful routine was about to be dramatically disrupted, and he would soon need to call upon the courage and strength he hadn't used since his days in uniform. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in May. Frank was pruning his roses when he heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. At first, he didn't think much of it. Vehicles passed through Pine Grove all the time. But this sound was different. It grew louder and louder until the ground seemed to shake beneath his feet. 12 motorcycles, their chrome pipes gleaming in the afternoon sun, rolled into the abandoned supermarket parking lot next to Frank's property. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets with "Road Warriors" written across their backs in bright red letters. Their arrival sent Mrs. Peterson's cat running for cover and made several birds take flight from Frank's cherry tree. Frank watched as they dismounted their bikes, their heavy boots crunching on the cracked asphalt. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms, looked around the lot with a satisfied smile. He spotted Frank watching them and raised his hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. That evening, Frank called the local police station. Officer Thompson, who had known Frank for years, listened patiently but explained there wasn't much they could do. As long as they're not breaking any laws, Mr. Walters, they'd have the right to use that parking lot. The property owner hasn't filed any complaints. The next day, more bikers showed up. The day after that, even more. Within a week, the abandoned parking lot had become their unofficial clubhouse. They brought in old chairs and tables, set up a makeshift bar using coolers, and started having regular meetings that lasted late into the night. The peaceful atmosphere of Pine Grove changed dramatically. The constant roar of engines made it impossible for Frank to enjoy his afternoon gardening. The children who used to visit him stopped coming, their parents worried about them being so close to the bikers. Even Sally's Diner saw fewer customers during the bikers' usual meeting times. One morning, Frank found empty beer cans in his flower beds. When he went to pick them up, he noticed some of his prized daffodils had been crushed, probably by someone stumbling through in the dark. The sight of his damaged garden, which he and Margaret had tended for so many years, made his hands shake with anger. Mrs. Thompson from across the street brought him a fresh apple pie and shared the neighborhood gossip. "They're saying these bikers were kicked out of 3 other towns," she whispered, even though they were safely inside Frank's kitchen. "Apparently, they cause trouble wherever they go, but nobody stands up to them." Frank noticed other changes in the neighborhood too. Mr. Chen's young children no longer played in their front yard. The evening walking group of elderly ladies changed their route to avoid passing the parking lot. Even the mail carrier started delivering earlier in the day, before the bikers usually arrived. The final straw came when Frank overheard 2 bikers laughing about the old-timer who kept giving them dirty looks. "Maybe we should rev our engines extra loud when he's out there playing with his flowers," one said, causing the others to laugh. Frank felt his face grow hot with humiliation and anger, emotions he hadn't experienced since his war days. That night, as Frank sat in his armchair looking at old photographs, he noticed his hands were steady despite his anger. In one particular photo, he stood with his military unit in the Pacific, young men ready to face any challenge. The same determination he saw in his younger self's eyes was still there, reflected in his window as he looked out at the now quiet parking lot. Next to his chair, the evening news droned on about local events, but Frank wasn't listening. His mind was already working on a plan. He might be 93, but he had faced worse odds in his life. As he watched another group of bikers arrive for their nightly gathering, Frank reached for his phone and his old military contact book. It was time to show these bullies that they had chosen the wrong neighborhood and the wrong veteran to intimidate. The situation grew worse over the next few weeks. The bikers, emboldened by their increasing numbers and the community's fear, became more aggressive. They seemed to take special pleasure in targeting Frank, perhaps because he was the only one who dared to look them in the eye when they caused trouble. One particularly hot afternoon, Frank was tending to his garden when 3 motorcycles deliberately parked on the edge of his property. Their back wheels rested right on top of his carefully planted marigolds. Frank stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked toward the bikers with his grandfather's wooden cane in hand. "Excuse me," he said politely but firmly, just as he used to address his military unit. "You're crushing my flowers." The youngest biker, who couldn't have been more than 25, sneered at him. He wore a leather vest despite the heat, with multiple chains hanging from his belt. "Oh, look at that, boys," the young biker called out to his friends. "Grandpa's worried about his pretty little flowers." The others laughed, making engine revving noises with their mouths. Frank noticed how the youngest one's hand shook slightly when he lit his cigarette, a sign of nervousness he'd seen many times in young soldiers trying to act tough. That evening, after the bikers left, Frank found cigarette butts scattered across his lawn and an empty beer bottle thrown through his prized rose bush. The sight reminded him of the time his unit had found their camp vandalized by enemy soldiers, a clear message of disrespect and challenge. The next morning at Sally's Diner, Frank overheard whispered conversations about other incidents. The bikers had started demanding protection money from local businesses, claiming they would keep troublemakers away, though everyone knew the only trouble in Pine Grove came from the bikers themselves. Sally, who had been serving Frank breakfast for 2 decades, looked worried as she refilled his coffee cup. "They came in yesterday," she whispered, her usually cheerful face drawn with concern. "Said I should consider making them all free breakfast, or they couldn't guarantee the safety of my windows." Frank's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. Later that week, Frank was writing in his journal when he heard the roar of engines much closer than usual. Looking out his window, he saw 5 motorcycles circling his house, the riders shouting and laughing. They were playing some kind of game, seeing how close they could get to his mailbox without hitting it. The noise brought out several neighbors, who watched helplessly from behind their curtains. Mrs. Chen quickly pulled her children inside when one biker made a rude gesture toward them. The local police car drove by once but didn't stop. Officer Thompson later apologetically explained that without clear evidence of laws being broken, their hands were tied. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He sat in his armchair, looking at Margaret's picture on the wall. "You always said I was too stubborn for my own good," he muttered to her image. "But you also taught me that standing up for what's right isn't stubbornness, it's duty." The next morning brought the worst provocation yet. Frank stepped onto his porch to find his American flag lying in the dirt. The bikers had torn it down during the night, leaving motorcycle tire tracks across it. As he carefully picked up the flag, his hands trembling not with fear but with rage, Frank noticed something else. They had spray-painted "Old Man" across his front steps in bright red letters. Inside his house, Frank walked to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. There, wrapped in soft cloth, lay his bronze star and purple heart. He hadn't looked at them in years, but now they seemed to shine with renewed purpose. Next to them was his old military logbook, its pages filled with strategies and battle plans from a war fought long ago. As Frank sat down at his desk, his back straight despite his years, he began to write. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his community, about right and wrong, about standing up to bullies just like he had done more than 70 years ago. His pen moved across the paper with purpose as he began to formulate a plan that would show these bikers they had severely underestimated the old veteran they loved to torment. The morning started like any other, with Frank making his way to Sally's diner for breakfast. But today was different. The usual cheerful bell chime was replaced by the sound of breaking glass. 2 bikers had accidentally knocked over the display stand near the entrance, sending Sally's homemade pies crashing to the floor. Frank watched as Sally, her hands shaking, began picking up the broken pieces. The bikers laughed and took their seats, boots crunching on the scattered glass. When Sally brought their coffee, they complained it was too hot and demanded free refills. Her eyes were red from holding back tears. "It's okay, Sally," Frank said softly as she passed his table. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is survive another day." The words felt hollow in his mouth, reminding him of similar things he'd said to frightened villagers in the Pacific during the war. But this wasn't war-torn Philippines. This was Pine Grove, his home. Later that afternoon, Frank sat in his garden, looking at the damage the bikers had caused over the past weeks. His once pristine flower beds were trampled, cigarette butts littered the grass, and tire tracks cut ugly brown lines through the green lawn. Margaret would have been heartbroken to see their garden in such a state. The sound of motorcycles drew his attention to the parking lot. Today, there were more bikes than usual, at least 20 of them. The bikers had brought a grill and coolers full of beer, turning their usual gathering into a rowdy party. Music blasted from portable speakers, and the air filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of burning rubber as some riders showed off by spinning their back wheels. Frank was about to go inside when he heard a crash. Looking back, he saw that one of the drunk bikers had lost control of his motorcycle, sending it sliding across the pavement and straight into his fence. The white picket fence, the one he and Margaret had painted together every spring for 40 years, now lay splintered on the ground. The biker stood up, laughing with his friends about the old man's stupid fence. None of them seemed to care about the damage they caused. Frank felt something snap inside him, not in anger, but in clarity. He walked into his house, his steps measured and deliberate. In his study, Frank opened the cedar chest where he kept his most precious possessions. On top lay his old military uniform, still crisp despite the decades. Beneath it was a photo album, and as he opened it, memories flooded back. Pictures of his unit, of young men standing tall and proud, of battles won and friends lost. One photograph in particular caught his eye. It showed him and his best friend Tommy right after they helped liberate a small village from enemy forces. The villagers had been terrorized for months, too afraid to stand up for themselves. But when they saw that help had arrived, that someone was finally willing to stand with them, their fear turned to courage. Frank's hands moved to another box, this one containing his medals. The Bronze Star gleamed in the afternoon light, awarded for leading a successful mission against overwhelming odds. Next to it lay the Purple Heart, a reminder of the price of courage. He hadn't looked at these medals in years, but now they seemed to speak to him. Standing up, Frank walked to his desk and picked up the phone. His fingers, steady despite his age, dialed a number he knew by heart. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Jimmy. This is your grandfather," Frank said, his voice firm and clear. "Remember how you always said I should call if I ever needed a lawyer? Well, I need more than just a lawyer. I need your help with something bigger." As Frank explained the situation to his grandson, you could hear the bikers outside getting rowdier. But for the first time in weeks, their noise didn't bother him. In his mind, he was already forming a plan, one that would require all the strategic thinking he'd learned in the war, all the patience he'd gained over his 93 years, and all the courage he still held in his heart. By the time he hung up the phone, Frank had made his decision. These bullies had mistaken his kindness for weakness, his patience for fear. Now it was time to show them what a true warrior was made of, not through violence or intimidation, but through something far more powerful, the strength of a community united against injustice. Frank spent the next 3 days watching the bikers from his window, taking notes in his old military logbook just like he had done during the war. He wrote down when they arrived, how many came each day, and who appeared to be in charge. His grandson Jimmy, a successful corporate lawyer in the city, had taught him how to use his smartphone to take pictures of their illegal activities. "Know your enemy," Frank muttered to himself, remembering his old surgeon's words. He noticed that the biker group was largest on Saturdays, usually arriving around 10 a.m. Their leader, the tall man with the thick beard, always parked his black motorcycle in the same spot, closest to Frank's property. Frank wrote everything down in his neat, careful handwriting. Jimmy visited on Wednesday, bringing legal documents and news that made Frank smile for the first time in weeks. "Grandpa, I found out something interesting," Jimmy said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "That parking lot. The owner is another World War II veteran. He lives in Florida now, and he's not happy about how the bikers are using his property." Frank nodded, studying the papers through his reading glasses. Jimmy had gotten written permission from the owner to act against the bikers. But Frank knew legal papers alone wouldn't be enough. He needed something more, something that would make a lasting impact. That evening, Frank made 3 important phone calls. The first was to his old friend George, who had served with him in the Pacific and now lived 2 towns over. The second call was to Robert, a Vietnam veteran he had met at the VA hospital. The third call was to Michael, a younger veteran from the Gulf War who ran the local hardware store. "Remember how we used to handle troublemakers in the service?" George asked during their call. Not with fists, but with smarts and numbers. Frank smiled, remembering their old tactics. Within hours, George had contacted other veterans in the area, and they had all agreed to help. The next day, Frank visited Sally's diner, but not for his usual breakfast. He sat with Sally after the morning rush, explaining his plan. Her eyes grew wide as she listened, and then she started making calls of her own. Soon, other shop owners joined their quiet conversation. Even Officer Thompson stopped by, officially to get coffee, but really to listen to Frank's strategy. Frank knew timing would be crucial. In the war, he had learned that the right moment was just as important as the right action. He watched as more bikers arrived each day, their numbers growing as the weekend approached. They had no idea that the quiet old man they loved to torment was orchestrating their biggest surprise since their dishonorable discharges from various military branches. Information Jimmy had discovered during his research. On Friday night, Frank took out his uniform from the setter chest. It still fit, though a bit looser now than 70 years ago. He polished his medals until they shone, just as he had done before important missions. His Bronze Star and Purple Heart would tell their own story without him having to say a word. In his garage, Frank found the old American flag the bikers had thrown in the dirt. He had carefully cleaned and folded it, waiting for the right moment. Now, with steady hands, he attached it to the flagpole that had stood empty for the past week. He would raise it again tomorrow, but not alone. Late that night, as Frank made final notes in his logbook, he heard motorcycles revving in the parking lot. The bikers were having another loud party, celebrating their supposed victory over the neighborhood. Frank didn't mind the noise tonight. Let them celebrate. Tomorrow would be different. Before going to bed, Frank looked at Margaret's picture one last time. "You always said I was a patient man," he whispered to her image. "Tomorrow we'll see if these boys learn the same lesson we taught back in 44, that real strength isn't about making others afraid. It's about bringing people together to stand up for what's right." Setting his alarm for 6 a.m., Frank went to sleep with a peaceful smile on his face. In his dreams, he was young again, standing with his unit, ready to face whatever challenge came their way. Tomorrow, he would stand with a different unit, but the mission would be the same, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Saturday morning arrived with a golden sunrise. Frank was already awake and dressed in his formal military uniform by 5:30 a.m., earlier than his usual time. Every medal and button shone in the morning light. His hands were steady as he adjusted his collar in the mirror, muscle memory from thousands of similar mornings during his service. The first to arrive was George, Frank's old war buddy, wearing his own uniform and walking with the help of a polished wooden cane. Then came Robert, the Vietnam veteran, followed by Michael from the hardware store. By 7 a.m., Frank's normally quiet street was filled with veterans of all ages. They came from 3 different towns, some driving for hours to stand with a fellow soldier. "Just like old times, Frank?" George said, standing beside his friend. Both men watched as more veterans arrived, each wearing their uniforms or service caps, medals displayed proudly on their chests. There were veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and more recent conflicts. Some walked with canes, others stood tall and strong, but all shared the same determined look in their eyes. Jimmy arrived with a news van from the local station following him. Channel 5 was very interested in doing a story about community solidarity, he explained with a smile. 2 more news vehicles pulled up shortly after. Reporters began setting up their cameras, sensing that something important was about to happen. By 9:30 a.m., more than 50 people had gathered on Frank's property. Along with the veterans, many townspeople had come to show their support. Sally was there with coffee and donuts for everyone. Mrs. Chen brought her whole family. Even Officer Thompson stood nearby, officially there to maintain order, but wearing a small pin that showed he too had served. Frank looked at his watch. The bikers usually arrived around 10 a.m. on Saturdays. Right on time, they heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance. The sound grew louder as the first riders turned the corner onto the street. The bikers' usual loud chatter died down as they saw the crowd gathered near their parking spot. The biker leader, who had seemed so intimidating before, slowed his motorcycle to a crawl. Behind him, 20 or more bikers did the same. They faced something they hadn't expected, not angry neighbors or police officers, but a wall of decorated veterans standing tall in their uniforms, medals gleaming in the morning sun. Frank stepped forward, walking with purpose despite his age. His bronze star and purple heart caught the sunlight. Behind him, Jimmy nodded to the news crews, who began filming. The entire scene was being broadcast live on local television. "Good morning," Frank said clearly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I thought it was time we had a proper introduction." He stood at his full height, impressive even at 93 years old. "I'm Sergeant Frank Walters, United States Army, Pacific Theater, World War II." One by one, the veterans behind Frank began stating their names and service details. Each introduction echoed across the parking lot. Master Sergeant George Miller, World War II. Captain Robert Hayes, Vietnam. Corporal Michael Chen, Desert Storm. The list went on, creating a powerful reminder of service and sacrifice. The bikers remained on their motorcycles, engines idling. Their leader's face showed confusion and something else, recognition. Frank could see the man's eyes moving from one medal to another, understanding growing in his expression. Local residents began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their porches and sidewalks, watching in amazement as months of fear and intimidation faced a different kind of power, not of violence or threats, but of dignity and united purpose. Camera crews moved around the scene, capturing every moment. The morning sun cast long shadows behind the gathered veterans, making their formation seem even larger. The American flag, which Frank had raised again that morning with George's help, waved gently above them in the breeze. No one had thrown a punch. No threats had been made. But the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Frank stood his ground, waiting to see how the bikers would respond to this unexpected show of community strength. The next few moments would determine whether his strategy, born from decades of military experience and a lifetime of standing up for what's right, would succeed or fail. The parking lot fell silent except for the rumble of motorcycle engines. Frank took 3 steps forward, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. The biker leader, who everyone called Bear, turned off his motorcycle's engine. After a moment's hesitation, the other bikers did the same. Bear dismounted his bike slowly, his massive frame towering over most people present. But Frank didn't step back. He had faced bigger challenges in the jungles of the Pacific. The cameras continued rolling as Bear walked toward Frank, his leather vest creaking with each step. "You went to a lot of trouble for this, old man," Bear said, his voice gruff but not angry. His eyes kept moving between Frank's medals and the gathered veterans behind him. Frank smiled slightly. Sometimes trouble is necessary to make things right. He gestured to the torn-up garden, the damaged fence, and Sally's diner. "This neighborhood has been our home for decades. We've raised our children here, buried our loved ones here, and built a community here." Bear shifted uncomfortably, especially when Frank mentioned family. The news cameras caught every movement, every expression. Behind Frank, the other veterans remained silent but watchful, their presence a reminder of sacrifice and duty. "You know," Frank continued, his voice clear and strong, "in the war, I learned that the biggest bullies are often carrying the heaviest burdens." He paused, noting how Bear's shoulders tensed at these words. "Your vest patch, Marine Corps, right?" Bear's hand automatically touched the small Marine Corps pin partly hidden under his leather vest's collar. "How did you?" "A Marine would never normally disrespect the flag," Frank said, pointing to the flag flying above them. "So I asked myself, what would make a Marine forget his honor?" The other bikers muttered among themselves, some looking surprised at this revelation about their leader. Bear's tough expression cracked slightly, showing a glimpse of shame underneath. "My grandson Jimmy did some research," Frank said, gesturing to the young lawyer. "Found out you were a sergeant in Afghanistan, decorated for bravery. But when you came home..." Frank left the sentence unfinished, letting Bear fill in the gaps. Bear's face reddened. "That was a different life," he growled, but with less conviction than before. "No," Frank said firmly, "it's the same life, the same honor, the same duty to protect, not terrorize." He took another step forward. "We both know what it's like to fight real enemies. These people," he gestured to the watching neighbors, "they're not the enemy." The morning sun had risen higher, making the medals on every veteran's chest shine brighter. News crews moved quietly around the scene, capturing the powerful moment between the 2 veterans, one in his formal uniform, the other in leather and chains. "Your men follow you," Frank continued, "just like mine followed me in the Pacific. But leadership isn't about making people fear you. It's about earning their respect." He looked Bear directly in the eyes. "You once knew that. You can remember it again." Bear stood silent for a long moment. The other bikers watched their leader, waiting for his reaction. The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Bear's shoulders sagged slightly, the tough exterior cracking further. "I lost my way," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "After Afghanistan, things weren't the same. Found it easier to be feared than to deal with the memories." Frank nodded understanding. "Many of us here know that feeling," he said, gesturing to the gathered veterans. "But we also know there's a better way. These people you've been terrorizing, they could be your neighbors, your friends, your new unit." The cameraman moved closer as Bear looked around at the scene. The united veterans, the concerned neighbors, the damaged property, and finally, back to Frank's calm, determined face. In that moment, everyone present could see 2 soldiers separated by generations but connected by understanding. "What do you say?" Frank asked, extending his hand, ready to remember what that Marine Corps pin really means. The next few seconds would determine whether months of tension would end in peace or conflict. The whole neighborhood, the watching veterans, and the news crews waited to see if one old veteran's brave stand could change not just a biker's heart, but the future of their community. Bear looked at Frank's outstretched hand for what seemed like an eternity. The morning breeze carried the sound of birds singing and flags fluttering. Then, in a moment that would be replayed on local news for weeks to come, the tough biker leader reached out and grasped the old veteran's hand firmly. "Semper Fi," Bear said quietly, using the Marine Corps motto that meant always faithful. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke the words, perhaps for the first time in years. Frank nodded, understanding the significance of those two simple words. What happened next surprised everyone. Bear turned to face his fellow bikers and removed his leather vest. Underneath, he wore a faded Marine Corps t-shirt. "Boys," he called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We've been doing this all wrong." One by one, other bikers began to step forward. To everyone's amazement, several of them were veterans too. They had hidden their service behind tough exteriors and loud motorcycles, trying to forget the past instead of honoring it. "Mr. Walters," Bear said, turning back to Frank, "I owe you in this neighborhood an apology." He paused, looking at the damaged garden and fence. "We'll fix everything we broke. You have my word as a Marine." Frank smiled warmly. "Call me Frank," he said, "and I know just how you can make things right." Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened in Pine Grove. The bikers, led by Bear, began cleaning up the parking lot. They picked up trash, pulled weeds, and even helped Frank repair his fence. Some of the neighbors, seeing this transformation, brought out refreshments and joined in the work. Sally from the diner arrived with fresh coffee and her famous apple pies. This time, when the bikers entered her diner, they removed their caps and said please and thank you. Bear insisted on paying for all the damage they had caused to her property. As the day went on, veterans from both groups shared stories. They found common ground in their experiences, their struggles, and their desire to belong somewhere. The tough exterior of the motorcycle club began to crack, revealing the hurt and lonely people underneath. 1 month later, the parking lot looked completely different. The bikers still met there, but now they had permission from the owner. They had turned it into a gathering place for all veterans in the area. Every Saturday, they hosted a breakfast for former service members, with Sally's Diner catering the food. Frank's garden bloomed again, more beautiful than ever. The bikers had helped him plant new flowers, and some even started their own gardens at home. Bear, who turned out to have a gentle touch with roses, became Frank's regular gardening partner. The motorcycle club changed its name from Road Warriors to Veterans Pride Riders. They started organizing charity rides for military families and escort services for military funerals. Their leather vests still looked tough, but now they bore both their old club patch and their military service insignias with pride. The local news did a follow-up story 6 months later. They filmed Bear and Frank sitting on Frank's porch, sharing coffee and war stories. The once feared biker leader had become a regular visitor, often bringing younger veterans to hear Frank's wisdom and experience. Sometimes, Frank told the reporter, "People just need to be reminded of who they really are." He looked at Bear with understanding. "We all lose our way sometimes. The brave thing isn't never getting lost, it's being willing to find your way back." The story of the 93-year-old veteran who transformed a biker gang spread far beyond Pine Grove. Other communities facing similar problems reached out for advice. Frank and Bear even traveled together to speak at veterans' events, sharing their story of redemption and understanding. 1 year after that tense, Saturday morning confrontation, Pine Grove held a special ceremony. The town renamed the old parking lot Veterans Unity Park, with a plaque that read, "Where courage meets compassion, and old warriors help young ones find their way home." Frank stood at the ceremony, supported by Bear on one side and his grandson Jimmy on the other. Looking at the gathered crowd, veterans, bikers, and townspeople all standing together, he smiled. Margaret would have been proud. In the end, he had won his final battle not with fists or force, but with wisdom, courage, and the kind of strength that only comes from understanding another warrior's heart.